The Flame-Throwing Mind. September 4th, 2023. As the passage that we chanted just now said, everything is on fire. Where do the flames come from? From inside the mind. The mind is a flamethrower. It scorches everything we look at, listen to, smell, taste, touch, think about. Then we complain that things are hot. We have to look around and see. Why are we setting things on fire? Look in here for the source of the problem. If we can put out the fire here, then nothing outside is going to be on fire at all. Ajahn Lee has an interesting point that he makes in his talk on consciousnesses, that when the mind gets freed, everything else gets freed as well. Ajahn Mahabua makes the same point. He says we've been stealing things from the world, trying to make them ours. Then, as the case is being adjudicated, the fact that everything else is stolen goods taints them. But when we remove the taints from our own mind, the world outside is not tainted either. This is not to say that there are not a lot of problems out in the world. The world seems to be crazy right now. People are actually planning wars as if war were something reasonable. So we do live in a world that's not the best place to be. But we can practice, we can cleanse our minds, we can put out the fires inside so, at the very least, we don't have to suffer from things outside. As we learn how not to suffer, we can help other people not to suffer too. Sometimes we're told that Theravadins are selfish, looking after their own good, trying to end their own suffering without trying to save the rest of the world. Well, you can't save other people. People suffer because of their own lack of skill. You can't make somebody else skillful, but you can show people that it is possible to behave in a skillful way. It's like the ways in which manual skills develop. Back in the time of the European Enlightenment, they made an encyclopedia. The encyclopedia contained a lot of articles on the manual skills that people were practicing, and it tried to bring some scientific knowledge to them. Once scientific knowledge came to one craftsperson, other people in the same craft picked it up pretty quickly. They saw, this is possible, this can be done. Sometimes they'd learn it from the first person, sometimes from the simple fact that the first person had done something like that. Others would look at what he had done and try to figure out, how did he do that? Like Ajahn Lee in India. The first time he went there, he was amazed to see the sadhu standing on one leg out in the sun all day long, or lying down on beds of nails. The question came to his mind, how do they do that? He didn't ask them. He looked into his own meditation. And the message he got was that they worked with the breath energies in the body, so he decided to work with his own. So sometimes the fact simply that somebody can do something inspires other people to do it. They figure out that this is a possibility that hadn't occurred to them before, but once it does occur to them, they see that it's good and they figure it out. This is one way in which we help the world. We figure out how we're setting things on fire and we can put out the fires. Then other people see, oh, that's possible. It hadn't occurred to them before. That possibility hadn't presented itself to their awareness. But when it's there, it sets a good example that they might be inspired to follow. So we're looking for happiness in a way that doesn't harm anybody and can inspire other people to look for happiness in the right way too. But the first thing we've got to do is to put our own house in order. How are we setting fire to things? We want them to be a certain way, and then they're not that way. Or if they are that way, we want them to stay that way. If they're not the way we want them, we're upset. This habit we have of trying to take things and then make something else out of them is how we became beings to begin with. But then we apply it in a lot of the wrong places. Think about the process of becoming. It starts out with some pretty unpromising raw materials, feelings, perceptions, thought constructs, acts of consciousness, very simple things that are not very lasting. In fact, they're very ephemeral. Yet we want to create a sense of our identity as a solid thing we can depend on, and the world as something we can depend on. And we do a fairly good job, good enough at least, that we can deceive ourselves. We try to forget that the raw materials are very, very ephemeral. We're proud of the fact that we can make something out of them. But then when they prove recalcitrant and don't play along, we get upset. So you've got to look back into the mind's habit of taking something and trying to make something else out of it, and ask yourself, where does the problem come from? Here again, the problem comes from within. We're trying to make something reliable out of unreliable things. If we could learn how to stop doing that, we wouldn't suffer. So you have to look at that pattern we have inside, what we want to make things into. There's something wrong there. We may be perfectly right that things would be better if they could be something else, but if they don't lend themselves to be that something else, then who's wrong, who's right? Ajahn Chah tells the story of 4 people going into the woods and they hear a cock crow. 3 of them put their heads together and say, "Let's have a little fun." They ask the question, "What is that? Is that a cock or a hen?" The other guy says, "Well, of course, it's a cock. It doesn't sound like a hen at all. How could a hen make a sound like that?" They say, "Well, hens have mouths. They can make sounds, can't they?" So they argue back and forth. The one guy is outnumbered by the 3 who are having some fun, and he gets all upset. As Ajahn Chah points out, he was right, but his rightness got him upset. Is it worth it? As for the animal that made the noise, if you asked it, "Are you a cock or are you a hen?" it wouldn't answer. So there are a lot of things in the world where, yes, you are right, things would be better if they were different from what they are. And there are some occasions when you can make them different from what they are. A lot of times, though, you can't. It's a real skill to learn how to live in the world and see where you can make a difference and where you can't, and not get upset about the areas where you can't. You find more and more that the important differences are the differences you can make in your own mind. After all, that's where the big problem is. The mind is on fire. If the mind were not on fire, nothing else outside would be on fire. None of the senses would be on fire. So this is where you focus your efforts to put out the fire, to see what you're feeding on, what you're clinging to. I've been looking into the question of the meanings of the words mind and consciousness and awareness in the Pali Canon, and it turns out that in different suttas, they mean different things. It's as if the Buddha gives us several different maps for analyzing our minds. In some cases, consciousness is just the passive registering of sensory input. In other cases, it's more active. It's actually proactive. It gets obsessed with things. It gets attached to things. What we normally think of as the activities of the mind are sometimes attributed to consciousness. The mind gets released, and a couple of suttas say that even consciousness gets released. So you could say the Buddha was inconsistent in his terminology, or you could say that he was offering different ways of analyzing what's going on in your mind, attacking the problem from different angles, all of which are useful for dividing things up, until you find that angle that works for you, the angle from which you can see that none of the aggregates are worthy of passion, the passion that wants to make something out of them. You can learn to do that with your own mind. When the mind is freed, then, as Ajahn Lee says, everything else gets freed too. When you put out the fires here and stop throwing flames outside, everything cools down. Everything is at peace. The constant theme through all this is dispassion. When you can learn to develop dispassion for these different processes that you've enjoyed so much, then however you analyze them, as long as you can develop dispassion for everything, you're doing fine. There are even passages that say when you have an experience of the deathless, you can have passion for that. So, you have to learn how to have dispassion for that too. Ajahn Lee, when he divides things up, says that some things are subject to the 3 characteristics, and other things are not. But that doesn't mean you hold on to the ones that are not. Everything should be let go of. That's where we're headed. That's how you put out the fires inside. In the meantime, though, you need to have some passion for the path. A question came up this afternoon about someone who's found that, as she's advanced on the path, she's found herself less and less interested in the things that used to hold a lot of interest for her. She's afraid she's going to suffer depression. Well, depression comes from a sense of powerlessness, that your actions don't matter, whereas dispassion comes from seeing that the things that you used to find rewarding don't really hold any reward. In the meantime, though, you've learned that there are things where you can make a difference, a good and useful difference. You can make a difference in your mind. You can put out the fires, stop throwing flames. And that's something you can get passionate about as you practice. Ultimately, you get dispassionate for that insight too. You get dispassionate for everything. But at that point, it's not depression, because you've found the ultimate happiness where everything can be at peace. Until you get there, though, you're going to be finding that not only is the mind not at the radiant mind, March 22, 2023. This mind is radiant, the Buddha said, but it's darkened by passing defilements. So exactly where does that radiance lie? He's not saying that the mind is innately pure. Ajahn Mahabua makes this point very clear. If the mind were innately pure, then how did it get defiled? And if a pure mind can be defiled, what's going to happen to it after it gets purified again? It could get defiled again. In fact, Ajahn Mahabua says that the radiance of the mind is actually part of its main defilement, ignorance, the defilement that's left when all the obvious defilements go away. But, the Buddha said, it's because of this radiance that we can train the mind. So when the Buddha says the mind is radiant, he's obviously not talking about a mind already enlightened or innately enlightened. He's talking about a mind that has the potential to clean up its act. This comes down to the fact that the mind can observe itself. Our problem is that we're not very observant. We don't get full use out of our powers of observation, which is why one of the main tasks in the meditation is to get the mind still and to get it asking the right questions so that it can observe itself well. In particular, we want it to learn how to observe itself making choices. There are so many choices we make that we're oblivious to. We're like a large corporation where decisions are coming out of the corporation, but no one seems to be really aware of who actually made the decision. We've got to get the mind still so that we can watch it, because obviously the mind is hiding some of its decisions from itself. That's what ignorance is all about. We've got to get the mind clear about what it's doing. Part of the clarity comes from the vocabulary the Buddha gives us for analyzing what's going on, say, in terms of fabrication, particularly the way the mind shapes its experience through its intentions. The breath is shaped through our intentions. That's bodily fabrication. Then we talk to ourselves with certain intentions in mind. That's verbal fabrication. And then mental fabrication, perceptions and feelings, the images we hold in mind and the feeling tones we focus on and encourage, those are shaped by our intentions too. Usually, we're awfully ignorant of how we encourage these things. Yet, as the Buddha said, we shape both the present moment and our future lifetimes through these types of fabrication. If we're ignorant of them, that's pretty scary. Fortunately, we can observe these processes in action right here as we meditate. In fact, we use these types of fabrication to create a state of concentration. You focus on the breath. You talk to yourself about the breath, and you use perceptions to help you stay with the breath. Ask yourself what kinds of perceptions help the mind to settle down with a feeling of ease in the breath. Think of the breath as a whole body process. As the Buddha says, when the mind settles down and has a sense of pleasure or even rapture, you want that to permeate the whole body. The best way to do that is to follow Ajahn Lee's recommendation. You think of the breath as an element filling the whole body. What you've got here is breath, breathing breath. To perceive it in that way gets rid of a lot of the harshness with which we sometimes breathe. There's the still breath, there's the subtly moving breath, there's the blatantly moving breath, and you want them to all be coordinated. Hold that perception in mind and talk to yourself in these ways. That way, you get the mind to settle down. At the same time, you get more conscious of how you do these things. As we discussed this afternoon, it's not always the case that one type of fabrication is always the primary cause of a particular emotion or mind state, although Ajahn Lee points out that verbal fabrications are probably the most important to watch out for, because we can tell ourselves all kinds of things. The way we talk to ourselves can make us miserable or very happy, given the same set of circumstances. And of course, when we're talking to ourselves, we're using perceptions, so those play a huge role as well. You change your perceptions, and that changes the conversation. Then again, sometimes the breath is what leads the way. You wake up in the morning, breathing in a weird way, creating headaches, creating discomfort in the body, and that can get you talking to yourself in ways that aren't particularly useful. So if you notice that happening, you've got to change your conversation. In other words, use whichever handle you can grab hold of out of these three types. The important point is that you become conscious of the fact that you are making choices. You want to be alert to see when the choice is made, what kind of discussion goes into it, and then the results of following through with that choice. That ability to step back and watch these things, that's the brightness of the mind. That's what allows us to train the mind. If we didn't have that kind of brightness inside, we'd be helpless in the face of our defilements. So that's where you look for the radiance. And being with the breath gives you a good place to step back from what's going on in the mind so that you can watch. It's through this radiance that we can nourish the Dhamma inside. Remember the Buddhist statement that there are two things that nourish the Dhamma. One is commitment, and the other is reflection. This ability to step back and reflect, that's how we learn. It's in the Buddha's instructions to Rahula, at the very beginning of the practice. Be conscious of your intentions, then ask yourself, where are they going? Where would they lead you if you follow through with them? If an intention seems unskillful, don't follow it. The reason for that is because if you act on intentions you know to be unskillful, it's going to be hard to learn from them. You'll tend to hide from yourself the fact that you could foresee that it was going to be unskillful to begin with, and yet you went ahead with it anyway. When you start putting up walls inside the mind like that, the mind gets darkened. So you try your best. After all, how are you going to grow as a person unless you try your best? Years back, when I was teaching English at the university in Chiang Mai, they had me teach literature courses. So for one of the courses, I had the kids reading The Good Soldier by Ford Madox Ford. It's not the easiest book to read, even for a native speaker, because the main point of the story is that the narrator is lying to you. He's trying to keep some secrets from you, even as he's telling you the story. So the way he tells his story jumps back and forth. Every time he gets to something sensitive, he skips over it further into the future or jumps back further into the past. Of course, for the students reading this in a second language, it was pretty confusing. So I gave them a timeline of the events, did everything I could to help them, but still there were complaints. Finally, when one of the students asked me, "Ajahn, why do you give us such difficult things to read?" I said to her, "If I gave you easy things, what would you learn?" It was as if a light bulb went off over her head, and she turned from a C student into an A student. When you stretch yourself, when you do your best and find out that your best isn't good enough, that's when you learn, because then you can ask yourself, what could I have done that would have been better? That's when you let some light into your mind. You allow the light that's there in the mind's ability to observe itself to have a chance. You're not constantly covering it up. So when you're acting on skillful intentions, but you discover that what you're doing is actually causing harm, you stop. You don't just blunder your way through, saying, well, it was a good intention, so it's got to be good. You have to tell yourself, maybe something was wrong with the intention, or maybe with how I carried it through, so you stop. There's nothing that you're doing that's creating harm? Okay, you continue with the action. Then when the action is done, you reflect. What were the long-term consequences? You see that you've caused harm. You talk it over with someone who's more advanced than you in the path, and then you make up your mind not to repeat that mistake. The talking it over, this is for verbal or physical actions, is to help you get so that you're not ashamed to discuss your mistakes with yourself. As for mental actions, you don't have to tell everything bad that's gone through your mind. But still, you should have a sense of shame over the fact that you gave in to jealousy, you gave in to pettiness and resentment or whatever it was. When you recognize that there was something wrong with the intention, you decide not to repeat that. This is how you learn. This is how you allow the light in the mind to show itself. This is how that light is useful for developing the mind. As the Buddha said, if the mind were not radiant like this, you couldn't train it, you couldn't develop it. So through this combination of commitment and reflection, you make more and more use of the light of the mind, the radiance of the mind. After all, we do have this ability to make choices in the present moment that don't have to be determined by the past. The Buddha was very critical of people who said that everything you experience is determined by the past, which means there must be something in the present moment that's not determined. You can take advantage of that ability to choose, that ability to be conscious of your choices. That's where the radiance begins to show. That's how you learn. This radiant mind is not the unconditioned mind or the unconditioned consciousness. That's something separate entirely. But it's a part of the path there, and it's a bright path. As Ajahn Mahabua points out, at the very end, you have to abandon even the bright path to get to what's really valuable in the mind. But wherever you see a glimmer of brightness, follow that for the time being, as it's heading in the right direction. You want to get to the point where the brightness of the mind is the only defilement remaining. Get rid of the obvious clouds and you can get more and more in charge of your own training. If we didn't have this radiance, we'd have to depend on other people to come and save us. But as the Buddha said, there's nobody else who can be your refuge. You have to be your own refuge. So take advantage of whatever radiance you find in the mind and encourage it through this ability to step back and observe, to be alert and mindful, so that you can check on the results of your ardency to see if they really are heading in the right direction. That's how the radiance of the mind helps you to develop. It can take you to something beyond it. The Dhamma is in the method. June 21st, 2022. It's the solstice. It's bright enough outside that the woodpeckers are still squawking. This is one of the 2 days of the year when the sun stands still. Night balances day. So try to get your mind still as well. Try to bring things into balance inside. Look at your mind. Look at your body. Look at your posture. Make sure your spine is straight, balanced, not leaning to the right, left, forward, or back. Then make sure your mind isn't leaning either. The Thai Ajahns use this image a lot. Leaning forward, of course, means leaning into thoughts of the future. Leaning back means leaning into thoughts of the past. Leaning left or right means leaning to things you like and don't like. Just try to be balanced and aware. But the awareness itself isn't enough. It's just the beginning. You want to be able to watch your mind thoroughly, so you give it a task. Remember that basic principle for nourishing the Dhamma. You commit, and then you reflect. This is basically the method of the Dhamma. Just as science has a method, the Dhamma has a method too. In the case of science, the scientific method is what ties everything together. The knowledge we gain from that method tends to vary over time. People think they've proven something, and then another generation comes along and says, "No, that's not quite right. Things have to be adjusted or thrown out entirely." So the content changes, but the method stays the same. It's simply a matter of learning how to apply the method better and better, with more and more finesse, more and more imagination. One of the ironies of science is that many scientists believe in strict determinism. But if you really believed in strict determinism, there would be no way to conduct the scientific method. You couldn't criticize someone for having designed a poor experiment because he or she was determined to design it that way. And the designing of the experiment wouldn't have anything to do with how things came out anyhow. So, one of the assumptions of the scientific method is that you can make choices as to what to do, and the things you choose to do will have different impacts on the world around you. In doing that, you'll learn things about the causal relationships among things, but the really important thing is the method. It's the same with the practice. We can learn a lot of Dhamma through reading about it. We think we understand what the Four Noble Truths and all the different wings to awakening mean. We may have the concepts down, but we don't really know them until we've applied the method. In other words, you try something out. Before you act, you ask yourself, what do you expect to be the results? If you expect any harm, you don't do it. If you don't expect any harm, you can go ahead with it. While you're doing it, look to see if any harm is coming up. If there is, you stop. If there isn't, you can continue. When you're done, you reflect on the long-term consequences. If you acted on that particular assumption, were the long-term results harmful or not? If they weren't good, what can you do to change? You've got to go back and reevaluate your original assumptions. This is how we take our book knowledge of the Dhamma and the knowledge we gained from thinking things through, and we actually learn it in a new way as we try to develop good qualities in the mind. So wherever you go, remember, apply the method. There may be points of Dhamma you're 100% sure you understand. But you've really got to test them as you put them into practice if you want to understand them fully. The Forest Ajahns, again, make a lot of this. They say it's like learning military science. You can draw diagrams on the blackboard, analyze old battles, see what lessons you can learn by looking at past battles from the outside. But when you have to go into battle yourself, you find it's a very different experience as you see the battle from the inside. You've got to learn how to think on your feet, to test things. If they don't work out, you've got to use your imagination, use your ingenuity to come up with a new approach. Quickly, that's when the Dhamma becomes yours. And you know it's Dhamma because it gives good results. This is why the teaching on karma is such a basic part of the teaching, i.e., the principle that your actions will give results based on your intentions in line with the principles of cause and effect. If your actions made no difference, or if you couldn't choose your actions, then there would be no way that you could test any teaching. To believe that you can test a teaching by the results it gives when you put it into action means that you have to believe in the reality of action, in your ability to choose your actions, and in the principles of cause and effect. Those principles follow a pattern, enough of a pattern that you can learn from them. That too is something you have to believe if you're going to test any teaching. If there were no pattern, the lessons you learn today wouldn't necessarily help you tomorrow. But you have to do things again and again and again until the pattern becomes clear. This is why we meditate again and again, because the mind is complex. Sometimes a method that works today won't work tomorrow. The fact that it doesn't work tomorrow doesn't necessarily mean that it's bad, or that there is no pattern, or that you weren't observant today, simply that conditions tomorrow are different. Your mind is in a different shape, your body is in a different shape. So you have to test things again in lots of different situations until the pattern becomes clear. The Buddha gives some standards for judging how well the test goes. And again, you're going to learn these standards first by hearing about them, but you're really going to come to appreciate them only as you try to apply them in practice. Those standards are in the list he used to teach his stepmother about how to recognize what's Dhamma and what's not. The two main standards have to do with the goal of the practice. We're trying to practice for dispassion and for being unfettered. Being unfettered means that the mind is released, and it's interesting that those two go together. You gain freedom through dispassion. That's looking for freedom in a place where we ordinarily might not think of looking. But remember the Buddha's prescription for how you bring about dispassion and free the mind. You look at things as they arise, see what their origination is, i.e., what event in the mind causes them. You look at them as they pass away as the cause ends. You have to see what their allure is, what their drawbacks are. When you can compare the allure and the drawbacks until you can see that the allure is false, or it's certainly not worth all the drawbacks, then you can let go through dispassion. That's the escape from those things. Basically, you grow up. The word dispassion doesn't sound all that good. It sounds like you're dead. But that's not what the Buddha means. It's basically a question of maturing. It's like seeing a game you used to play that no longer holds any fascination. Like tic-tac-toe, as a child, when you haven't figured out what the best moves are, you can keep playing it again and again and again. But then you begin to see there's a pattern. If you start with X's or zeros in certain boxes, you're sure to lose. When you see the patterns clearly, you lose your fascination with the game. There's no need to play it anymore. That's dispassion. It basically sees that the mind's been playing a game with itself and going for the allure. But when you see that the drawbacks way outweigh the allure, you ask yourself, why continue playing that game? It's not worth the trouble. You've outgrown it. So, those are the standards we use to measure our practice in terms of the goal we want to accomplish. Then we look at how our practice has an impact on others. The Buddha says you want to be modest. You don't want to show off whatever attainments you have. You don't go around bragging about your concentration. There's a nice story in the canon about Ven Anuruddha's novice. Anuruddha, you may remember, was the monk with the divine eye. He, more than anyone else except the Buddha, could see devas. He could see what's going on in all the different levels of the universe. He was also the one who, on the night of Buddha's passing away, was able to keep track of where the Buddha's mind was in the different levels of concentration before he entered total nibbana. Anuruddha had a novice who could levitate up to the Himalayas, wash Anuruddha's bowl in the pure waters of a lake up there, and then levitate back. His main thought was how to do this without anybody seeing him. That's the kind of attitude you want to have about your practice. You're not showing off, it's your secret treasure. You also want to practice in such a way that you don't get entangled with others. You're looking for seclusion. Physical seclusion first, so that you can gain mental seclusion from defilements in your mind. and you try to be unburdensome. You don't make big demands that this has to be that way, that has to be this way in any fashion that would place an undue burden on others. So as you're practicing, if you notice that the way you practice is getting you entangled or making you burdensome, you've got to change. You realize, okay, what you thought was the Dhamma is not the Dhamma, or your interpretation of it was not right. You've got to go back and look at it again. Then there are the qualities you develop inside: contentment, persistence, and what the Buddha calls shedding. Shedding refers to shedding pride, shedding thoughts of wanting to get revenge. There's another great story in the canon of a young prince whose parents had been executed by a king. The prince decides to get revenge, so he applies for a job in the elephant stables of the king's palace. In the evening, he plays the lute to soothe the elephants. Well, the sound of the lute wafts from the elephant stables into the king's quarters. The king likes the sound, so he has the young man brought in to play for him. That soothes him. He tells the young man to stay as part of his own private retinue. The young prince works to be trusted by the king, and finally gets the king in a position where he could, if he wanted to, kill him. But he decides not to. He's stopped by something his father had said before being executed. Don't look too far. Don't look too close. Animosity isn't ended by animosity. It's ended by non-animosity. In other words, the father was basically saying, don't try to get revenge. The prince at that crucial moment finally understood what his father's words meant. Apparently, in one of his previous lifetimes, the Buddha was the young prince. He told this story to monks who were involved in a controversy over minor rules, and he said, "Look, here are noble warriors who live by the sword, yet they can still have forgiveness. They can still shed their pride and thoughts of revenge. Why can't you as practitioners? Revenge may be too strong a word for the feelings you may have for others. But sometimes you just want to get back at somebody, with the conviction that you're right about wanting to see them suffer, but your rightness is creating a lot of trouble. There are ways of being right and yet wrong at the same time, so you want to learn how to shed those." Then the pair of contentment and persistence. You're content with material things. If the food, clothing, shelter, and medicine you have is enough to keep you alive, to keep you practicing, okay, then it's enough. But you're not content when unskillful attitudes come in and take over your mind. You don't just leave them there saying, well, that's just the way it is. I've got to learn how to accept that. I shouldn't try to figure things out. I shouldn't try to pass judgment on these things. I should just learn how to accept them. That's stupidity. These things that come rising up in the mind influence your actions. If you have any sense of compunction, you realize, as the Buddha says, that you've got to wipe them out of existence. Remember his statement that one of the secrets to his awakening was that he did not rest content even with skillful qualities. In other words, if they weren't skillful enough to take him all the way, he kept on looking for what was more skillful. When he described his path of practice, he said he was in search of what was skillful. He left home in search of what was skillful. After he studied with the two Ajahns and was disappointed in their teachings, he went out alone in search of what was skillful. When his austerities didn't work, he went in search of what was skillful. When he finally got the mind in right concentration, he wanted to know the skillful use of his concentration. So he used it to gain the three knowledges, and in each case, he asked himself, once he had gained that knowledge, what's the skillful use of this knowledge? In terms of the first two knowledges, there were people who had attained those before him. There were people who had seen their previous lifetimes and then set themselves up as teachers. But the Buddha realized that that wasn't the skillful use of that knowledge. It had to be pursued further. Seeing that the way he had been reborn went up and down, up and down, up and down, around and around, the question was, why? How? He had a vision of all beings in the cosmos dying and being reborn in line with their actions, skillful or unskillful, based on skillful or unskillful views. Again, there had been people before him who had gained similar knowledge and set themselves up as teachers. But the Buddha realized that that wasn't the skillful use of that knowledge. The skillful use would be to figure out, how do you end the suffering that comes from this endless round? He focused in on his own intentions. He focused in on his own views there in the present moment. That's how he was finally able to gain awakening. So he didn't rest content. He kept searching. Given that I have this, what's the skillful use of it? And if something is not skillful, how do you abandon it? If your practice is that kind of practice, then it's practice going in the right direction. You're following the right method. After all, how do you know what's skillful and what's not skillful? You do what you think is skillful, and then you look at the results. You put this principle into action, and what happens? You put that principle into action, what happens? Are the results satisfactory? It was his unwillingness to be satisfied easily. That's how he became the Buddha. So these are the principles, the ways of measuring your actions as to whether they're really skillful or not, whether they're Dhamma or not. You want to keep these principles in mind so that wherever you go, you've got the method to test things. It's interesting that the Buddha taught these principles to his stepmother. As we see in the canon, there were very few times when the Buddha himself went to teach the nuns. Occasionally his stepmother would come to him with a question. But otherwise, he would have the monks go teach the nuns in his place on a regular basis. But early on, his stepmother came and asked for a short teaching that would help her in her practice. He gave her these principles so that she could learn how to depend on herself, to test what is and is not the Dhamma. So, this is the method. This is how the Dhamma gets tested, and the test is what guarantees the Dhamma. As I said, you can read the books, you can think things through, and it can all make sense, but if you don't actually put things into practice, you don't really know, you have no guarantee. And if you don't put them into practice, you don't understand the subtleties even of some of the concepts. We had an old man come and stay with us at Wat Dhamma for several years. When he was younger, he had been ordained as a monk, studied and passed the 7th grade of Pali exams, which was pretty advanced. But then he disrobed and got a job with the government. When he retired, he came out to live at the monastery, and he was constantly contemplating the meaning of different Pali phrases. He still kept his interest in Pali going. Ajahn Fuang made an interesting comment one time. He said that this man's understanding of the Dhamma was really crude. Here was someone who passed all those exams, had lots of knowledge about the language, but that was it. It was just words, and words are crude compared to the real thing. If you want subtle knowledge of the Dhamma, you've got to practice and to be very observant. Use your ingenuity. You've got to use your think. July 15, 2022. When we built the Chedi, the spired monument at Wat Dhamma, the architect was a fan of the Finnish architect Eero Saarinen. The lines were very clean, very graceful. A couple years later, Ajahn Fuang and I flew around the world. We came to America to visit my family, among other things, and we flew into Dulles Airport in Washington, which had been designed by Saarinen. That was back in the days when you landed at Dulles and went right into the main terminal, which has a big roof shaped like a hammock. So I pointed it out to Ajahn Fuang. I thought he might be interested. He took one glance at it, didn't say anything, that was it, so I figured he wasn't interested. A couple weeks later, though, when we got back to Thailand, I learned that he had described the roof in great detail to the architect, talking about how it was an amazing piece of architecture. I mentioned this just to point out that Ajahn Fuang was extremely observant. He could glance at something very quickly and take it all in. So, think about that when you hear that his meditation instructions tended to boil down to two things. 1. Be observant, and 2. Use your ingenuity. Really be observant to understand cause and effect. Watch what you're doing, watch the results very carefully, and if they're good, keep it up. If not, they're not. You've got to figure out what and how to change. He talked about one time when he was a young monk just getting started. The meditation instructions back in those days were very simple. He didn't have Ajahn Lee's 7 steps because Ajahn Lee hadn't formulated them yet. The basic instructions were just to get the mind to settle down, or in Thai, to bring the mind down, Hai Sati Long. So he forced it down, 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 and it got very heavy and unpleasant. So he figured, this must not be right. Turn it around. How about bringing it up, 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 up? So he brought it up, way up. but that wasn't right either. Eventually, he found the right balance, but he did not by just accepting things. He did it by thinking about things and trying to find solutions to problems. That became the basic pattern of his meditation. You see this throughout the forest tradition, the emphasis on thinking. There's a great passage in Ajahn Mahabua. There had been a controversy in Bangkok. A group had claimed that Nibbana was your true self, so a lot of scholarly monks came out and said, no, Nibbana is not self. The controversy became so heated that it actually got into the newspapers. Can you imagine the New York Post running articles on whether Nibbana is self or not self? That's basically what you had in Thailand. Even the popular everyday newspapers, not just the highly regarded ones, got involved in the fray. Someone took the question to Ajahn Mahabua and asked him whether Nibbana was self or not self. His answer was, Nibbana is Nibbana. Self, not self. These are perceptions. You use these perceptions on the path, but when you get to Nibbana, you've got to let go of all perceptions. As he was delivering this answer, he kept saying, Fikarana si, which in Thai basically means, think, use your brains. It's a theme throughout the forest tradition. Of course, it's a theme in the Buddhist teachings too. He talks about how to listen to the Dhamma and put it into practice. You start out by listening well. As he says, you lend ear. You actually try to remember what you've heard. Then you try to penetrate the meaning, in other words, figure out what it means, and then you contemplate it. Ponder it, he says, until it makes sense. See that it fits in with the rest of the Dhamma you've learned, how it fits in with the rest of the Dhamma, because it is supposed to fit in. As the Buddha said, that's one of the tests for the Dhamma, that it's consistent. It leads consistently to its atha, its purpose or goal. It all has to work together to aim to that goal, the goal of release. Once you see that it makes sense in this way, you give rise to a desire to practice, followed by a willingness to submit yourself to what you've learned. And there, he says, you contemplate. So, you don't just ponder it to make sure that it makes sense, but you contemplate how it's going to apply in your own case, and you judge how well you're actually applying it. You've got to think this through. When you hear a Dhamma talk, it often deals in general principles that are right for people at large. As I pointed out yesterday, generally, I advise people not to force the breath into different parts of the body, but there are times when there are exceptions, and sometimes you find that you're dealing with an exception. So be alive to that, contemplate that, use your ingenuity, and then put forth the right effort. Right effort has to rely on your thinking powers. There's no place where the Buddha ever says that the rational mind is an enemy or that the rational mind gets in the way. The Dhamma is all supposed to make sense, and if it doesn't make sense, you have to ask yourself, okay, where is my sense of making sense lacking here? Because it all fits. I know one prominent case where people interpret the Dhamma so that it doesn't fit. This is where they interpret mindfulness as being a broad, accepting, open state of mind where you don't make any choices, don't pass any judgments, whereas with concentration and right effort, you have to develop certain states in the mind and reject other states. The question is, how can you do all of those things at the same time? After all, the path is supposed to come together. One solution that someone proposed was that the Buddha actually taught two paths. A sixfold path of right mindfulness, without right effort and right concentration, and a sevenfold path of right effort and right concentration, but without right mindfulness. Yet that doesn't make any sense. You have to go back and see where the modern definitions are wrong. Actually, mindfulness is not an open accepting state of mind. Mindfulness has its agendas. You're trying to keep something in mind. In the case of the body in and of itself, you're trying to keep with the breath right now, and you're ardent, alert, and mindful. Alert means to watch what you're doing along with the results you're getting. Ardent means that you're trying to do this well, trying to do this skillfully. As the Buddha said, when mindfulness is a governing principle in your practice, if there's anything unskillful in the mind or your behavior, you try to get rid of it. If there's anything that's skillful that hasn't developed yet, you try to give rise to it. When it's there, you try to maintain it and get it to develop even further. In other words, instead of watching things coming and going, arising and passing away, without interfering, without passing judgment, you're actively trying to make good qualities arise and to prevent them from passing away. When you understand mindfulness in this way, then it fits perfectly in with right effort and right concentration, because right concentration is the result of this kind of mindfulness. And right effort, of course, is there in the ardency. So think. And try to think in a way that solves problems. A lot of people use their thinking to create problems. The Buddha shows how to think in his treatment of questions that are to be answered categorically, those that have to be analyzed before you answer them, those that require cross-questioning, and those that should be put aside. One of the important parts of developing your discernment is learning to judge when a particular question falls into a particular category, to realize there are some issues that, no matter how much you think about them, are not going to get you anywhere on the path. Other questions have to be answered in a straightforward way. You have to figure out which is which. And you have to develop the discernment that the Buddha says is like an archer's skills, able to shoot far distances, able to fire shots in rapid succession, able to pierce great masses. Firing shots in rapid succession, he says, is basically seeing the Four Noble Truths. What this means is that you watch the mind and notice when it's creating stress and when it's not creating stress. Sometimes it goes back and forth very quickly between the two. You can gain an insight and then immediately latch on to it. Okay, the insight was good, it's part of the path, but the latching onto it is not part of the path, and it's going to cause more suffering, which is why you have to be quick. Shooting far distances means seeing implications. There's that passage in the Not-Self discourse where the Buddha talks about how you look at the five aggregates in the present moment and see that they're inconstant, stressful, and not self. But you don't stop there, you think about the implications. Whatever you remember about the past, even if you remember past lives, comes down to just these five aggregates. And wherever you might go in the future of this life or of other lives is going to be composed of these same aggregates. You think about the implications of that. You realize that no matter where you go, no matter what you would latch onto, it's not worth latching onto. It's all going to slip away like water through your fingers. You think about the consequences, you think about the implications. As you think about them, that insight into how the aggregates right here in the present moment are not worth latching onto makes you less and less inclined to want to come back here or anywhere else at all. It makes you more and more inclined to want to get out. That desire to get out comes from the fact that you thought. And finally, piercing great masses, you're able to pierce your ignorance. In other words, when you're looking at something and you see that there's stress, turn around and look inside. That's where the big mass of ignorance is. Our attention, for the most part, gets directed outside. Even when we're practicing meditation, we're watching certain events in the mind, but who's doing the watching? The observations about what you're watching, do they apply to the watcher as well? They do. That's where the mass of ignorance is, so turn around and look there. If you develop this all-around set of skills, then your thinking really does lead to discernment, and the discernment does lead to release. When we look at the canon, all those suttas, all that analysis, we realize, this is not the fruit of a mind that didn't think. The Buddha thought very carefully, thought very skillfully, thought with a lot of circumspection. So, when you meditate and you're reflecting on what you're doing, you've got to learn how to think. Think in a way that cuts to the chase, that sees things as they're happening and doesn't create a lot of needless issues. Years back, one of my students had gone to a retreat with an ajahn who liked to talk about life as an interplay of the relative and the absolute. He finished the retreat by sending everyone home with instructions to contemplate their lives as an interplay of the relative and the absolute. So my student came to me and asked a question about how to do that, and the question was so convoluted that I had to stop her. I said, "Look, just drop that issue. It's not useful, because it's dealing in abstractions." The Buddha didn't deal in abstractions. He dealt in watching realities, watching your actions, and watching the results. Those are things you can look at and think about without the abstractions, and you can see, this action causes stress, this action leads away from stress. Keep it simple like that, and things open up. That's when you know you're using your thinking powers in the most fruitful way.